Okay, and we're live.
Thank you. Good evening. I call the June 15th, 2021 meeting of the Community Task Force to order. Thank you for joining us this evening via live stream. We are conducting this meeting online as is allowed by state law under the current state of emergency due to the pandemic. With that being said, Deidre, could we please begin roll call?
Yes. Ms. Adams? Mr. Impanza?
Here.
Ms. Bannister? Ms. Biliconti? Ms. Spapona? Ms. Franklin? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Napke? I see Will is on.
He's probably at a volleyball game.
Could you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm here.
Miss Maria?
I'm here.
Mr. Robinson?
Here.
Miss Satya Praya? Mr. Shoji?
Here.
Miss Smith? Miss Sofarora?
I'm here.
Mr. Wang?
Here.
And Mr. White?
I'm here.
Thank you for that. It is a pleasure to have with us for the first time Dublin City Schools' new superintendent, Dr. John Marshausen, and Dublin City Schools' new DEI coordinator, Dr. Bernice Hamilton. It is a pleasure to meet you guys and wonderful we could have you with us today. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves personally for the people meeting you for the first time?
Go ahead, Bernice, you first.
Good evening, and thank you for having me as a part of this meeting tonight. I am Bernice Hamilton, as you said, the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Dublin City Schools. My background includes a plethora of things. I am most recently, I'm coming from Miami University regional campuses as the Director of Diversity and Multicultural Services. Prior to that, I worked at Wilmington College as the Director of Multicultural Services, and I am a 25-year veteran, retired from the Cincinnati Fire Department. It's a pleasure to be in this community and to work with so many wonderful people who have put diversity, equity, and inclusion at the forefront. And again, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, John Marshausen, superintendent now of the Dublin City Schools. I've had the opportunity, I think, Jamil, we had the opportunity to speak when I joined this group as superintendent of the Hilliard Schools, and had the opportunity to speak with the subcommittee, which included some of our high school students. Very proud of the work that we were able to start in Hilliard and pass that baton on to Mr. Stewart and the team there, and excited to begin this important work as part of our mission and vision for the future here in Dublin. So thank you for the invitation and look forward to engaging in any way we can. It truly takes the entire community to make a difference and to create the environment that we want, not only for our students, but for our families in a place that we all want to live. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Moving on, members of the task force should have received minutes of our previous meeting. Does anyone have any questions or changes regarding those minutes? That being said, I'll accept the motion to approve the minutes.
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Mr.
Anyone-
Chair, would you mind, I'm sorry, who seconded?
I did.
Stephen
Thank you,
White.
Mr. White.
Thank you. Anyone opposed? Thank you. Moving on, we're going to begin our conversation about our draft BEI plan review. I would like to stress to the task force members that this is a very important meeting. This is, if not the last meeting where we can really dive in and talk about our draft recommendations that we want to get out. I really want to encourage dialogue, any thoughts, any concerns about our draft that we're about to talk about. And once again, I'd just like to say, any comments, highly recommend that is said today. If it comes to your mind that you've forgotten something, please get back to us as soon as possible, hopefully within a week. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Kirby.
Thank you, Kofi. Good evening, members of the task force. I'm going to share my presentation with you real quick. And we'll start by just reviewing, where we've been recently and where we're going. So at the May 18th meeting, we communicated our final proposed aspirational goals and went over some of our indicators of success. We also reviewed and accepted the draft demographic assessment and terminology section. And on the calendar for this evening is a review of the initial draft and a discussion and potentially amending the proposed document. We can also discuss the future role of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Board. Moving forward, July 20th will be theoretically our final meeting should there be no bumps in the road. July 20th, we will review the proposed resources needed to support the City of Dublin's DEI plan and review, amend, and approve the final draft. Now, obviously, we're going to City Council after that, so we wouldn't have another meeting. However, if needed, we could squeeze in another meeting between July 20th and August 16th, where the chair and vice chair will present the proposed City of Dublin DEI plan to City Council. It is my goal that we do not need to squeeze in a meeting. However, if there is more content and there are more amendments that you feel need worked into this document, we can make time. So to start, I want to ask a question. What do you guys think of the name? Dublin Community Task Force Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Plan. Dublin Community Task Force Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Framework. We've thrown around the term framework and plan periodically, and they kind of run parallel. Which do you prefer?
I think the framework works best because when we think about the purpose of the task force, it was to get things started. So when we talk about the title, I believe framework, best encompasses what our duty was for the task force, which was to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I would echo the comments of the chair here, that in the sense that if you say framework, it gives us a nice basically foundation. My concern would be if we call it the plan, I think that would work, but then others may think that, well, this is it, right? We've sort of put the document out there. Here's the plan. Rather, if we provide a framework, our work's not done, in the sense of it takes a community, it takes each of us to continue to strive, to grow, to do better. And so my recommendation would be to Kofi's that we call it framework.
I agree.
So in agreement, and having looked at kind of what we are discussing, it does, as you said, Mr. White, open up growth and for the changes. And I think that's going to be perpetual and that's what we're hoping for in order for there to be growth. So within that framework, it also gives us a boundary, but not stagnation.
I'm hearing consensus, but just want to check in. Is there anybody who is concerned with the term framework? Seeing a lot of head shaking, we'll move on. All right, so next there's a few questions about the advisory board. Should we, as you may have seen within the task force introductory letter penned by both the chair and vice chair of the task force, this body is recommending that we create a long-standing advisory board to oversee the implementation of this framework. Do you believe that that introductory piece does enough to set up that idea, or should we include the idea of an advisory board within an indicator of success or an aspirational goal? Should we recommend a specific format for council to create, or should they be able to construct that how they see fit? And lastly, what resources do you think are needed for this advisory board to flourish and to execute the framework that we have put forward?
I personally think that the mention we made in the letter is insufficient. And I did, one of my notes to myself after reading through that framework is, where is the, aspirational goal regarding the establishment of a DEI advisory board? Or so personally, I think there should be some direction from our group to establish it. And I also think that we should be giving some guidelines, if not many, to the city council as to what we think might work based on our experience this past year or so.
To go on what Bridget said, I believe that putting a DEI advisory council into work should be within the indicator for success, because it will hold the city to its promise that this isn't just a one-year thing, and that it should be a long-standing process. So having the creation of this long-standing board, I believe, should be within the indicator for success.
I will echo that as well. I concur with my colleagues here that having that advisory board as an indicator of success, and I would actually go a little bit further with your third bullet in recommending that we put some resources, that council put some resources behind that as well. Now, whether those resources come in the form of staff support or another area, I think we need to put a little bit of some recommendations behind not only setting up the advisory board, but also a commitment to make sure that the board has sufficient resources to be successful.
I think one way we can accomplish that is including the implications of an advisory board within a priority area, specifically as an aspirational goal. And then those indicators of success could really be laid out as specifically to city council providing staff time or certain resources to advance the purpose of the advisory board. I think functionally within our document that would probably work best, but I'm open to any suggestions.
I would think that ESAU and the chief, given your experience with the community, with your advisory board, and your experience with our task force, I'm not suggesting there's any negatives, but I'm sure there's some positives and negatives with how things are working there, and perhaps you guys have, and yet you might have some suggestions as to how best we could frame and form the DEI advisory board. I'd be inviting your input, whether it's today or before the next meeting.
From my point of view, what I really have noticed as a key difference between this body and the advisory committee, Chief's advisory committee, is the willingness of the entire body to together take time, slow down, and really dissect an issue on hand. And that is only possible because we have the time on our side on the advisory committee. On this task force, I always forget what the term is. On this task force, we're obviously bound a little bit more closely by the time or the deadline. And that I felt really forced us to either limit the length of discussion or the people with whom we discuss, say in a subcommittee format. So definitely that is going to be a plus, and that would be something I think any future members of the advisory board should have should be looking forward to. And I think maybe, along with our recommendations, perhaps some broad topics that the advisory board looks forward to discussing, maybe as an example, might be a way to better illustrate what this body is going to be like.
Thank you for that, Isao. I actually want to go off on that. I had actually written down in my notes a few points that I would like to recommend and get some input about when it comes to the creation of the longstanding committee. Reviewing the past year for the task force, I wanted to really dive in on what we did well and what we could have improved on. I think the size of our task force is a great size, 16 people. It's not too big, but yeah, it's not too small. I think for a longstanding committee, we should recommend to stay within the size of 16, but once a year, we should have a total a number of 3 meetings that you can miss within a year. So within a year, if you miss more than 3 minutes, you'll be recycled out with somebody else. I think this is important because it will hold people to being almost like committed to our meetings, but then also making sure that we can have continued discussions, because there's been a good amount of times during the task force where we've had to start the meeting 10 minutes late because we haven't had anybody. So summing up what I'm saying is, I think we should recommend that our task force stay around the 16 member range, but once each year we have a total amount of meetings that you can miss before being replaced.
Personally, I think that 16 is too big of a number for a task force. And the only reason I say that is because when you want to really zero in, you want to make sure everyone knows that they're, of course, accountable. I'm not saying that the 16 are not, but if it gets too big, people tend to kind of say, oh, so-and-so is going to do it, or it's been done, and they don't do that active role. So definitely, yes, having that ongoing committee, but making it smaller. And then you may not have to kind of have those consequences of missing the meetings, because I guess people probably be more engaged when it's a smaller group as opposed to 16.
I think the danger of going too small, as lower than 16, is that you run the risk of missing some of the demographics, and you run the risk of not getting all the communities represented, which I think should be one of the main focuses of this advisory board, is to make sure that every community has a stake. And if you make the group too small, you run the risk of a community being left out.
Those are really good points, even though they're contradictory. The police community advisory board, if I'm getting the terminology right, how many folks do you guys have on that?
There are 10 appointed community stakeholders on the advisory committee. However, those discussions also often include members of the police department administration who are part of that. So those groups are typically between 10 to probably, I would guess, close to 15, 16 members total. But I mean, to the points that everyone has made, I think that the advantage we have had, as Mr. Shoji mentioned, in having regular meetings gives a sort of continuity to the conversations, and also an opportunity to let sometimes that dialogue marinate over the course of several meetings so that you get to extract all of the perspectives over time on a particular topic. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm very proud of both groups, and certainly the task that the task force has undertaken is broader in scope. And so that requires, a lot more consideration. And I think what you guys were able to do in breaking down into subcommittees was exactly right in being able to tackle those areas of focus. But as you have regular scheduled meetings, I think the opportunity to, as Esau mentioned, really sit down and talk about those topics at a granular level, I think is the advantage of identifying a standing committee moving forward. And I think that everything I've heard up till now about making sure we're including as much of the perspective of the community as a whole and individual communities in that discussion also is a product of having regular opportunity to have a regular standing meeting to have those conversations. So, but they're large groups, but manageable groups even at that size.
I think something that would be best for us when talking about this is maybe we don't want to right now say a specific number of people we want, but a range of people we want could do for now. For example, I would recommend having 13 to 16 people, 13 to 17 people. Any comments would be appreciated on that. But then also I would like to also talk about how long we would like the terms to be. 1, 2 years, whatever.
Yeah, I like the recommendation of adding some flexibility there that gives the city really some flexibility on their end, and perhaps even the opportunity to pivot if that's the case, if based off of interest level and or success level of the group as it moves forward over time. The one thing I might also add is obviously we were sort of forced our hand a little bit because of the pandemic on the digital side. I don't suspect, or at least I would hope that the group would meet in person. That I think would help benefit the level of detailed discussion and dialogue once we get out of this, sort of Zoom or WebEx format. Not that we can't do that, not that the group can't do that, the city can't do that, but then also providing that flexibility to connect in person, I think would add to that dialogue. The point about the terms, I think is a good one. And I would recommend that if we're gonna provide some context on the terms, that we have staggered terms as well, right? So, if it's going to be we have some institutional knowledge over time that enables the board to continue to be successful, so it doesn't roll over, every 2 years and then they're sort of starting from scratch again. So if we could have some of that staggered from a term limit perspective, if we're gonna add that into the equation as well. Those are my thoughts.
I don't know if it's appropriate to jump in, but I just do this sometimes. Kirby, I don't know if you would know, the city may have a process by which it appoints people to standing committees in these types of groups, types of size, types of process, those types of things. So it would be interesting to know, does the city typically have a way when it creates a committee or task force or working group? How do they do that? The other thing is, would it be possible for the school district to have an ex officio member of the group? And when you talk about those ranges, it would be a non-voting member who is that liaison between the city schools and this group. And that way, if Dr. Hamilton were to be that person representing the schools, she would be a non-voting member, but would have a place on the agendas to communicate and collaborate back and forth. I know in my role as superintendent, I'm an ex officio member of the Chamber of Commerce, of the Dublin Community Foundation, and it would allow the schools to be that partner during this work. So as I'm listening, those are two thoughts I have. Kirby, I don't know how the city creates these kind of subgroups.
I am not aware of how exactly functionally that works. Chief may be able to speak to that a little better than I can. However, I think that there is some freedom in design, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I think if so, as part of the resolution for these two groups, council, if, for example, the advisory committee appointed the members of the advisory committee on rotating terms, so that they there is some again some continuity of continuation, whether that be in the chair positions or in other positions. And I think there were 1 or 2 year terms. City council just had their meeting. Trying to remember what day it is, last night, and they appointed a new member, I believe, to the CSAC committee last night. So there is a process for that, and certainly if we were, for example, to have a member who could no longer continue with the Chiefs Advisory Committee, what we would do is then go through the process of elevating the city council a recommendation and seeking their approval for that person to be added to the Chiefs Advisory Committee. So there is a process. It's just a matter of figuring out logistically what we would desire as the size of the group, and then working through how we would make recommendations for city council to approve those appointments.
So putting together what everyone has said, I'm going to summarize it, and if anyone opposes or disagrees, let me know. Putting together what everyone said, we would like to see a long-standing committee with a range of 13 to 16 members with staggered term limits and an attendance policy per year.
May I just add the connection to the school district as well?
Yes.
Are there, I think that sounds great, Mr. Chair. Are there any other ex officio type groups besides schools that we got to think about for our recommendation?
We have a chamber representative on this task force, do we not?
I don't
Would
believe
something like that be an ex officio capacity?
for the business side of things, we did talk a lot about there's a yeah, from a business perspective, that might be a good recommend. I think that I like that recommendation.
In the original resolution that council passed, there is a Dublin Chamber representative who is to be determined by the chamber. That's how it's spelled out in the resolution. But I don't know who that was in the beginning, or I don't know. Kirby, do you know? Okay.
That's fine. So to go along with the representative from the school, we can also add Dublin Chamber representative as well. All right, hearing no other comments, Kirby, would you like to continue the presentation?
So quick question before we move on. Do you all support the current sequence of content? Obviously, I based the table of contents and the outline off of other DEI plans that I had found in my research. Sequentially, do you think that everything flows well together? Are there any changes that you would like to see?
Looking at the draft that you sent us, it flowed really well. I didn't notice anything that didn't flow well, but if someone did, I'll be glad to hear it. But I didn't see anything that stuck out to me when it came to not flowing properly.
I agree. The one thing I did wonder, although this doesn't change the flow, was when you referenced the Pacific University glossary of terms. I went back to the Beaverton Plan just to see how they handled it, and they had opted to intentionally offer definitions for 3 terms: diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I just think maybe from the reader's point of view, it might be helpful if we decide to go ahead and define at least those 3 terms, maybe a couple others in the framework itself, so that they don't have to try to go, look at the link and look among the 150 terms for ones that they want to look at. That was the one thing, the main addition I was thinking might be helpful.
I think that's a really good idea. So one clarifying question that I have regarding that idea, if it would be supported by the other task force members, is would you use the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion from Pacific Northwest, that resource that we adopted, or would you be looking to alter and create your own?
Since I happened to look at both of them, the Beaverton Plan and Pacific University, it was interesting. They're not the same. A surprise. So maybe Dr. Hamilton can help us just sort of, maybe she could take a look at those 3. We could share, those 2 sources, and perhaps it'll be obvious to her what might be the most appropriate to use, or maybe there's some combination of them. That's just a thought.
It would be my pleasure.
Is there anyone opposed before we move on? All right, so our next slide, we're going to have general discussion about our priority areas, specifically the layouts, the aspirational goals, the indicators of success. I have the draft pulled up, and I can drag it over for all of us to take a look at. But I thought that we would start our conversation just by hitting each of these on the way down. And if I need to pull it up for all of you to reference specific indicators or what have you, we can do that. So I'd like to start first with public engagement. Are there any concerns, questions, comments, suggested amendments to the aspirational goals and indicators of success within the public engagement priority area?
I would like to just give a positive feedback to this section. When we were talking about the reevaluating Dublin's communication to make sure we're getting every group of residents, because not every resident is on Facebook or Twitter. I thought that was a very good addition, and a round of applause for that one. That's all I have to say.
Are you giving yourself a pat on the back because your subcommittee put it on there?
No, more so to Vincent, because Vincent's the one that came up with that idea.
Oh, that's true.
I'll pass Kofi on the back.
Would anybody like for me to pull up the draft so that we can skim through them? Anybody need to review those? So
Have our guests had a chance to review these drafts ahead of time? Okay.
Dr. Hamilton, did you have any feedback?
Not at this time, but I'd like to take a deeper dive into them and possibly make some suggestions after that. Thank you.
Sure. All right, hearing no other input, let's move on to city practices. Were there any perspectives that you would like to share regarding city practices? So I know city practices is its own quote unquote subcommittee, and there will be an opportunity for me to give an update as to the progress of the subcommittee. But I think that this is just as good of a place as any to give you an update as to what we're doing. let me pull this over real quick and I will show you where city practices is within this document. As you can see, indicators of success are not complete yet. That is because the city has recently started its own internal evaluation based off of the feedback and multiple activities coordinated by our consultant, Steve Francis. We now have an internal committee of over 25 employees who's taking a look at all of our priority areas, aspirational goals, and we've divided up into subcommittees among ourselves to tackle the indicators of success for each of the aspirational goals that are provided within this document. We've reviewed the language of those goals, and there have been a couple meetings where the full 2 hours has been us debating the language and how we want to go about doing this. We meet on a weekly basis for 2 hours. So these indicators of success will be completed in time for the August 16th City Council meeting. We're working on it.
So Kirby, to that comment, are you suggesting that at the next meeting, you wanted to share that out, or at the August date that we had earlier?
So it would be my goal to provide that to you at our next meeting. I am not running the subcommittee. I'm participating in it, and I can give Homer a nudge in the right direction. And I'm going to try to do everything I can to get them there in time. Any comments or thoughts about the language of the aspirational goals that are provided within city practices?
This is just me for the education and awareness, and I know language is one of the hardest thing to gather. Just that part of enhance, I think it's a bit vague. It would, at least for me, it would be a bit vague. But what do we mean by enhance? Is that, are we accepting? So I don't know. Enhance its understanding and awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think I would like more of a statement to also indicate a commitment, not to action, not just to the understanding. And that, again, that has to do with language. So I'm not an expert on that.
I can absolutely empathize with those sentiments. Just from seeing this list, it seems rather vague. When we started, our goals were incredibly prescriptive, and that ended up leading us down a path that kind of constrained where we could go with our strategies for implementation. So we strategically decided to cut back some of the language within the goals and move them to our indicators of success in specific operations. So I can absolutely see where that would be somewhat concerning. However, I can assure you that within the indicators of success, we will get there. All right, moving on. You received aspirational goals and indicators for public safety within this draft. I think this is one of the first times that you've seen them. Do you have any feedback, any amendments, any ideas, any questions for the chief or ESAL? And again, if you need me to, I can pull them up.
Under public safety, for the section pertaining to community engagement, I would like to point out that I feel community engagement should also include citizens speaking to the police force, which I'm sure that's what was implied, but it wasn't listed there. So I just want to stress that community engagement is police force speaking to the citizens and citizens speaking to the police force as well. So any type of dialogue, I would like a town hall maybe, something along those lines of dialogue. I would think is a very good thing.
And I would like to just comment on, I think it was page 14. I'm trying to look at my notes here. Procedural justice, I think, is a really interesting idea. I actually hadn't heard that phrase. And I didn't know if there was reason to get a little bit more specific with how Dublin police would actually enact, procedural justice. And I was wondering why only with young people. It seems like a concept that would be perhaps valuable, with most interactions with Dublin residents or anybody that the police are interacting with. I'm sorry, my husband is setting off all these fireworks in anticipation for July 4th. I don't know if you can hear him, but I can hardly think. Sorry.
Bridget, that's a fantastic point. So there were really 3 documents that we took a look at as we brought these initial recommendations together to talk about at our last advisory committee meeting, and then worked through as we prepared them for offering tonight for consideration. The first document obviously was the Beaverton Plan, which we've all taken a look at and used as sort of the framework for how we are building our community plan here. The second was a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan from the University of Michigan Department of Public Safety, and it was their diversity, equity, and inclusion plan from 2016 to 2021. And the third document was a document that we've taken a look at as an advisory committee from the start, and it was the Principles of Procedurally Just Policing. And it was a publication that was put out in January 2018 by the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. So we used that as sort of the framework for, as we initially came together as an advisory committee, just sparking some ideas for what those conversations were going to look like for us coming together, and maybe how we tackle the idea or concept of policing broadly, but then with some specificity of where do we want to enter that conversation from. And so, the theory of procedural justice, and this is from the document, the theory of procedural justice is grounded in the idea that people's perceptions of police legitimacy will be influenced more by their experiences in interacting with officers than by the end results of those interactions. So the idea of policies and activities and focus from a police perspective being procedurally just and perceived as procedurally just by the community. One of the sections, because it does break it down, that overall document for recommendations for police agencies, specific categories, one of which is transparency and public engagement, procedural justice inside the police department, officer interactions with communities, and then procedural justice for particular groups. So that bullet point really came from an examination and conversation that we had about police and youth interactions. So you're absolutely right. It applies to any interaction. The focus for that was really finding a way to interject in an aspirational goal, a consideration for, as a police department, as a public safety entity, as we consider those vulnerable populations we are looking to protect within a community, one of which is youth. And so that particular focus and emphasis was a conversation we had at our last advisory committee meeting, and fortuitously, I am a member of the Ohio Collaborative, the Ohio Community Police Collaborative, which establishes standards for police departments across the state of Ohio. And earlier in that day of our last advisory committee meeting, that was a standard that we set upon taking up for the next standard for the state, which is police youth interactions. And so that was certainly on my mind, part of the conversation we had, and so that became one of the bullets that's included as an offering and a recommendation. How we refine that certainly is we want that to be applied in every direction, in every interaction. It just it made its way into the recommendations currently under that sort of idea or thought. So, but thank you for asking the question, because that certainly gives the opportunity to explain and expound upon one of the bullets from the public safety perspective.
Thank you for that. So maybe we could just amend it to say that that procedural policing would, be something that you would look to implement with special emphasis on young people, for example. So there's not an exclusion of all the other interactions.
Yes, I think that's a perfectly valid suggestion, and certainly, anything we can do to give clarity to those bullet points, we would be happy to make amendments to.
I had a couple other questions about this section, but I want to defer to somebody else if anybody else had some comments or questions. I wasn't sure where, I have a particular concern about dealing with domestic violence. I mean, I'm presuming that is, one of the ongoing challenges, and I just didn't know if it was important as a task force when we're talking about public safety in our suburban world. If we thought that there should be some attention or maybe an assessment related to domestic violence, or if there was a reason to mention it explicitly. And when I was thinking of that, I was thinking in part about, just how the police might handle that challenge, like they might handle other challenges that aren't easy to handle. And that was then bringing me to a whole category, which I don't have any information about, and maybe it's not appropriate here, but I was thinking about, municipal courts and maybe people that were in the Dublin jail, and this whole concept of so many lower income folks not being able to, basically pay bail or whatever the terms are to get out of the situation, or maybe they're more likely to, make a plea, the things that we've heard about perhaps in larger cities. I don't know how that applies to our suburb, and I don't know if this is the appropriate place to mention that or bring it up as something that we would have an aspirational goal to at least understand maybe what's happening, because maybe we don't, or maybe we do, and there are a few suggestions we'd have to consider.
Yeah, the first point on domestic violence, I think there is a portion under the recommendations where there is a recommendation for review of policies that are have the capacity to impact the public and continual review. And again, one of the virtues we have from having established the advisory committee is the opportunity to continually go back and revisit and look at policy, so that to make sure we're not engaged, the way we articulate it here from the police perspective is that we're not just tethered to traditions and engaged in past practices, but that we're always looking for the opportunity to be moving towards best practices. And so I think under that section of policies where we have, it's not an exhaustive or all-inclusive list, but we've listed some of and highlighted and elevated some of those policies we would want to see regular return to make sure we're examining, are we engaged in the right response activities to ensure public safety. I think that's a place we could include domestic violence within that section. And so that would be one recommendation I would have, and certainly we can take that away and then come back to the list later. On the issue of the concept of bail reform, we don't operate a jail in Dublin. We have a processing facility here at the Justice Center, but we do not house anybody here at the Justice Center for longer than a period of time. Most occasions they would come here, we would do photograph and fingerprints and paperwork, and then take them to one of the 3 county facilities. So Dublin doesn't necessarily operate a facility where we would require bond here, and there would be some function of reform other than the mayor's court in taking bond for some offenses. Dublin doesn't have a municipal court, we have a mayor's court. But so that conversation is one we can have at a community level, at an advisory committee to share some information and awareness, or frankly, that's an entire function that isn't under the police department. That is a function you could have at a community advisory committee in the future to have some awareness of what does our municipal court look like in its operation, and what are some of the ways we can take a look and make sure, again, that procedural just practices are enacted as part of that function within the city of Dublin.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts and perspectives for the chief before we move on? Hearing none. Next, we have economic, sorry, turn my screen off there. Next, we have economic empowerment. And again, I can bring it up if you need it.
So I did have a question on page 14. Let me see if I can pull it up. I think I saw it earlier on when I was reading. And it says, what was that? Something about the language. Let me see if I can see where it talks about bold assertions. Yes, that's what I wanted to talk. Can you talk a little bit about that? What it has been worded that I think it was page 14 about bold assertions. Can't find it now, but I remember that was a phrase that that stood out to me, and I just needed a little bit more clarity on that. Okay, there we go. Yep.
I think, Nancy, is that actually maybe on page 17? No, 18. Is that what? Yeah. So I guess Anissa might want to jump in too. This is under the diverse business support aspirational goal in economic empowerment, and the bullet is the city recognizes and embraces the fact that bold assertions attract people and entities which share the city's diversity values. And I think our subcommittee came up with that, and Esau, you can correct me or add. I think it was generally the sense that we felt pretty strongly that we wanted bold assertions, meaning not tepid, like, oh, one toe dipped into the water, we're for DEI, we're a welcoming, diverse community. It was more the effort to suggest that we want to embrace DEI, we want to embrace our identity as a welcoming community with an interesting diversity of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic levels, etc. And so bold assertions was trying to suggest that the city and any promotions that we might do about our city and our community would be, lend itself towards something more bold rather than something a little lukewarm. I don't know if, Esau, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think in general, you summarized our discussion very well. I think we did struggle a little bit with regards to how much or what to say about city practices, knowing that there was a separate section for this. And we are not necessarily here to dictate what the city practices should be, especially in this context. But just like Bridget said, we felt that it's not enough simply to say we support DEI. I mean, in this 21st century environment, who's going to stand there and say that they don't support DEI, right? So just to make that statement really isn't going to make us any different from anybody else around us. And for us to stand out and really put a stake in the ground and not be afraid to be noticed and to attract the people that share our values that we are trying to put forth, we felt that our statement, our declaration or proclamation, or whatever term you might want to use, needed to be bold. And it was also in the context of us talking about an aspirational or an aspirational goal. And we thought, as long as we're being aspirational, we should push for boldness. That was the context of where this particular statement came from.
Any other thoughts and opinions about economic empowerment? Would anybody like me to scroll through all of the indicators of success? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to housing.
Again, our subcommittee worked on housing, and I think in the translation of the draft that we provided to the city and what has ended up in the framework, there were a few changes that I had some questions on, and I know the meeting is lasting longer, so I don't know if right now is the time to bring it up. I don't think they're that substantive.
I would ask that you bring it up so that we can get it before our next meeting and change it so that you're comfortable.
Well, this was a more substantive one on page 19. I don't know how folks feel. That very first line, I think it's page 19. I'm not convinced that we want to say that a strength of our city is the high price of our homes. I mean, that's essentially, I understand that from an economic development perspective, you can definitely justify that the higher cost of homes and rent here in the city has some advantages, but I think from our DEI perspective, that it's unnecessary to actually say that that's a strength. So I would suggest we delete that first sentence.
Would anybody disagree?
So I think when you're giving, since this is the background that you're talking, I guess instead of putting it as a strength, because it is a fact, so we just leave that there, but not as a strength, I guess, is that what you're saying?
I think Nancy, I think the rest of the info makes it pretty clear if they read through it that yes, the fact is the City of Dublin homes definitely cost more. And we could, I'm sure, Kirby, you could rewrite that first sentence just to be a little bit more factual rather than just saying the strength. I'd be fine with that.
I don't have a vote, but if I did, I would say that the first sentence is not needed. The second sentence does a really good job of setting up the median property value. Obviously, it's relatively high, but we go on later to talk about the differences in mortgages and rental rates. So I think you hit the nail on the head, Bridget, that it's unnecessary.
In fact, I think keeping that statement in will make it somewhat inconsistent with the rest of the section, where the recommendations, I think if any logical person is reading this, is going to encourage diversifying values of houses that exist within the city of Dublin.
And if we can move on page 20, I'm sure you guys noticed it, the one success metric was repeated, the one about landlords. So you just want to delete one of them from the framework. I think it's page 20.
Right here, correct?
Yeah, you see how there's oh, I'm sorry, I have my notes in front of what you're highlighting. Yeah. Sorry, the first.
Yeah, it's right. It's just it's that first bullet and skip that bullet. The second bullet's a repeat.
Yeah, delete the first bullet you have highlighted because it shows up again later. Thank you. And then on page 20, the housing study, when the subcommittee was considering how the housing study that Dublin was doing we were thinking it was covering an area broader than the city of Dublin. And we had initially used the terms, in the city, within the entire Dublin school district, and in closely bordering neighborhoods. Trying to find which one that was.
So if I remember correctly, I believe that I incorporated that into the description of this aspirational goal, the quote unquote housing study. So the city commits to a clear and deep assessment of past and current housing realities in the city regarding current residential demographics, housing, rental stocks, and the documentation of specific housing practices, regulations, policies, and ordinances. Is that what you're referencing, potentially putting in more than just the city and speaking specifically to the school district and neighboring political subdivisions?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure it out where it is. Maybe I'll have to get back to you, but I guess I'd ask the task force, I think we were clearly, the city of Dublin doesn't have control over anything outside of the city of Dublin, but I think it's important for us as a task force to recognize that there's a lot of people who don't, who are associated with Dublin or consider themselves part of Dublin, but they're not in the city of Dublin proper. So we know that includes some members of the Dublin School District, which happens to be myself. I live in Powell, but my kids go to Dublin City Schools, and I feel totally as if I'm a city of Dublin person, even though I'm not technically a resident. And I think when we talk about housing, it's not only including, recognizing that it's outside of the city of Dublin, there's Dublin City Schools people, but there's also like just bordering neighborhoods that I think identify as members of Dublin, and I think definitely affect how those folks feel like they're part of our community. And I didn't want to lose that broader view of recognizing that even though the boundaries aren't really clear, we want to be sort of sensitive to and aware of those folks out there. So I cannot specifically find the bullet right now, but I don't know if anybody disagrees with that, because if you do, then maybe we just drop this. But if everybody feels comfortable with that, I can find the bullet and share that with you, Kirby, after this.
I think that's a good point that you bring up, because I'm just thinking, case in point, we have the 4th of July, the city of Dublin, puts up, and because of the numbers, we've had to cut off, because I know people who've said, well, my kids go to Dublin, or I'm in Dublin, but I'm not a Dublin city resident, and so I've always looked forward to coming for this and can't do that this year. So I think you're right. That is definitely something that I've heard from the community, as far as feeling you're living in, your kids are going to school, but yet the community is telling you that no, you're not part of us. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
Bridget, it seems as if the consensus is to include that. So if you could circle back with me, I'll make sure to put in the exact language that you said.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's nothing else that's looking at my notes that I feel like I have to bring up right now. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, concerns regarding housing? Hearing none, we'll move on to mobility and transportation.
There was the misspelling. It's Coda Pivot app, which I think, again, we would have found. It says Codo Pivot or something. Somebody, automatic spell check probably, but it's Coda Pivot app.
Thank you. All right, before we move on to our last priority area, does anybody have any concerns, comments about mobility and transportation, the language that was used within the indicators of success, any of the aspirational goals? Any areas in which we're missing? Hearing none, let's move on to community building and inclusion. Any comments? Would anybody like me to pull it up and scroll through for them? Okay, hearing none, that concludes our review for this evening. My last question for you is, do you feel as if you have had enough time with this document to adequately review its content and get to a point in which you support its passage?
I would like to suggest, since we don't have, we're missing some people that I thought would be with us tonight, is there a way if the chair and I reach out to folks, maybe just texting or something, and we could say, within 1 week we're trying to finalize text, like one additional opportunity for input that doesn't require another meeting, but gives you all the draft language so that we're prepared for the next full meeting.
If you are comfortable doing that, we can absolutely do that. The only concern I have is that then the other task force members do not have any input on the input and are not able to either provide their support or express their dismay. But if you are comfortable doing that, we can make that work.
I was comfortable until you said it that way, Kirby.
I'm so sorry. It's the pessimist in me.
It's a good point. It's a really good point. Kofi, and other folks, what do you guys think?
I mean, what if we just say that, if there's anything glaring that you see or something that's you think is to review it, and if there is, I mean, Kirby, I know we said we're not going to create another meeting in that schedule you shared earlier, but if there is something there that is, a super, hey, red flag type thing, then maybe they have the opportunity to bring that to the next meeting and we could address it up front. Could that work?
Absolutely. And that was my thought earlier. As long as there aren't significant overhauls, we can accept the document with with certain amendments that we explicitly write out within the public meeting and vote on. So then when we go to city council, it is exactly the document that was submitted before your next task force meeting, but with the amendments that you explicitly approved within that meeting. So that is an option. And then also if there's, if something is on fire, like you said, we could then decide to throw in another meeting 2 weeks before the task force or 2 weeks before the council meeting and use that as our opportunity to approve the document, and our July meeting as an opportunity to go through and review again. So this can be rather fluid. I'm comfortable with communicating via email and figuring that out amongst the group.
One thing I just want to remind the group of, we have, I don't know if it was at the end of the last meeting, preparing for this meeting, but the importance of everybody being at this meeting so that everybody is heard. And this is the time, to do that. So I don't know how much that impacts what you all just said. But I know that we have been trying to emphasize the importance of, especially this meeting, how important it was.
I think the best way to go about this is the people who weren't here. we can reach out to them and say, hey, you know, is there any red flags that you see, like Stephen mentioned? But when it comes to adding something, I don't think it would be appropriate for them, because we need to be able to have dialogue on what they recommend, and that won't be doable over email. It's unfortunate if they do have some type of dialogue to add, but we were stressing the importance of being at this meeting. So once again, we can reach out to anybody who wasn't here to let them know, hey, this is what we did. Look at it. Do you see any red flags? But when it comes to them adding significant input, unfortunately, they missed the timeline.
Mr. Chair, I agree with you. I think Kirby did an excellent job in providing all the information for the committee members and providing plenty of opportunity to seek the inputs. And from a efficiency standpoint, I would suggest that we vote on the current version. In the meantime, we provide additional opportunity for other people to comment. That we can, if there are substantial amount of feedback, we can include as a separate amendment, right? We can vote on those in the future.
So I'm a little unclear what our next steps are. Is anybody more clear than me? Are we?
Bridget,
We're
I can
saying
share
this is pretty much it, but we're asking folks if there's a red flag to let us know ASAP.
So, Bridget, if you don't mind, I can hop in here and kind of summarize what I think we decided our step forward is, and then you all can correct me when I'm wrong. So at our July meeting, we are going to vote to approve this draft plan after the changes are implemented that we spoke of tonight. So that is the inclusion of Bridget's sentiments, the chief bringing back the sentiments that we had regarding the public safety, to have a conversation with their group, so on and so forth. Within the meantime, then maybe the chair and vice chair will reach out to individuals who were not here tonight and ask if there are any glaring red flags that were not communicated. If there are not, then we'll move forward and vote at our next meeting to approve or disapprove, whichever you all land on. If there are, then we could potentially vote to approve at our next meeting with a specific amendment. And that way we wouldn't have to have another meeting. Or if there are too many red flags, we could then have another meeting. So we would have two more meetings, one to discuss those red flags, and the second after to then approve before we go to council.
That sounds great. And we don't need a unanimous support. We obviously want that, but it is also feasible that we find out there is one or two folks who are unhappy and just haven't expressed that, and we're not able to address their concerns, and they can vote no if they come to the July meeting. But hopefully the majority would be voting yes at that time.
And also, I suggest that we set a deadline for providing the feedback. That way we have a scope very clear and set the expectation with all the members. Maybe we should say like 2 weeks from now. Day is the 15th, maybe by the end of this month.
From staff's perspective, the 6th would probably be the best deadline, because otherwise then I'm going to be scrambling to pull this thing together.
I think Kofi and I can reach out and we can just tell them they have a week and, you know, email it back to us, and then we forward it to you, Kirby, for inclusion or as an amendment. I would like to say that I would like to see the city's measure of indicators for the city practices. I mean, that is a whole section that we haven't had a chance to look at as a group. And I might have some input on that, but I don't know what you guys are saying yet. So that is an example to me of like something that there could be input that I guess we won't address because we have an overall deadline.
Yeah, Bridget, that's a good point. Kirby, is there a way, because I was thinking about that earlier, could you send that out ahead of time, so we're not seeing it the first time at the next meeting and then having to approve it, so that way we give ourselves a little bit more wiggle room on that? Would that be possible?
Yes, absolutely. If it is in fact finished, yes. Again, I'm going to do my nudging, but we have a process in which this is a part of our internal DEI framework. So we are creating a similar document to this, but for our internal use. So that's why this has been hung up a little bit, because they are on their own time schedule in attempting to garner all of the feedback and create a comprehensive plan, in which will be released to the public, and I believe may have potential for public input. So I will keep all of you informed as to how that nudging goes, and what our plans are. But if there are indicators of success that will be included within your document that you are taking to City Council, I will ensure that you have time to review it before you vote on it and approve it.
Sounds good.
Kofi, unless there are any other questions, that concludes my portion of the review.
Thank you for the presentation, and everyone, thank you for your commentary on the draft DEI plan. Moving on, we will go into subcommittee updates. Communication, education did not have a meeting. We have concluded. Youth has concluded as well. Economic and infrastructure has concluded as well. Moving on to city update, is there anything?
Other than what I shared there, there's only one update. CPI is putting together some communications regarding the work of both DEI groups. You should receive an email from Deidre asking for quotes or for your input regarding the process, in which could potentially be published within an article. So I would encourage your engagement with that. But otherwise, like I mentioned, the city's internal diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittee is hard at work. We're meeting weekly for 2 hours and really battling and grinding this thing out. So other than that, that's all we have.
Thank you. Is there a safety update?
I believe you are looking for something from Chief Pice, and he is having some trouble. He can hear the meeting but not speak, and he just wanted to let everyone know that the next meeting of the Chiefs Advisory Committee is next Thursday, June 24th.
All right, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Moving on, we have LGBTQ+ update.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to see new faces, Dr. Hamilton and Mr. Marshhausen. I hope I got that right. Nice to meet you. My name is J.M. Rayburn. I'm a city planner for the city of Dublin. I work on transportation and mobility projects for the city. And I'm also serve as the LGBTQ+ liaison for the city alongside Officer Amber McCloskey. So our job is to work with the city organization on policies and other improvements that we could implement in the spirit of furthering LGBTQ+ equality and protection and so on and so forth. For today's meeting, I don't know if you knew this, but it's Pride Month. That's a big deal for the LGBTQ+ community. It's a big deal because, being LGBTQ, that's just one identity of many identities that an individual has. To give you an example, I'm one voice. I identify as gay, but I'm also white. I'm a millennial. There's so many other things to me that you should know before you know I was gay. I could talk your off about city planning, for example. But the long story short is it's all about living your truth, right? It's all about being visible and being comfortable with who you are and sharing that with the world. And I think it's great that we've seen a lot of improvement in this area. I would say one of the arguments to be made about being, positive being in this community is that you learn empathy from many different spectrums of diversity that fall into the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that's a good thing. It transcends race, it transcends immigration, asylum seekers, but also, just, kids trying to grow up and be the true selves. So for me, Pride is a great time to show that you're either part of that acronym or you're an ally, which is great as well. What I want to share with you is that there's been so much progress in Central Ohio around LGBTQ plus community. To give you an example, Pride in Columbus is going virtual this year because of the pandemic, but a lot of suburban communities have stepped up and have celebrations that they're hosting. This past weekend, Westerville and Reynoldsburg and Worthington and Upper Arlington all had celebrations. Coming up, we're going to see New Albany and Hilliard, and Dublin is having a special lighting ceremony on Friday the 25th at 9 p.m. It's going to be at the Dublin Bridge. I really hope to see as many people out there as possible. This is a big deal for Dublin because they've not really had this kind of celebration before. And it's going to be, the backdrop is going to be the bridge lit in rainbow colors, which I think is a great welcome mat, a great beacon for the community. I can share my experiences, but I'm really moved by the emails I get from members of our community, particularly parents who have children that identify as LGBTQ+. And to have that kind of symbol in their community really is a big deal. And I hope it's a start of something exciting for the community as we go down this path. I do want to say, congratulations to Hilliard. Last night they passed a non-discrimination ordinance that encompasses sexual orientation and gender identity. I hope that this body will recommend something similar that council can consider later this year in terms of expanding what we have on the books for protections and non-discrimination. That is something that I still think we can improve upon in Dublin, but we're getting there. The last thing I would say, if you're an ally, thank you so much for your support, but there's always room to grow and learn some more. And I know there's some really great documentaries out right now. I have not had time to watch them, but I know FX had like a Pride series, which may be worth looking at. It goes through the decades of, the movement and what have you. So, educate yourselves. What is the Stonewall riots? Why were they so important? And you should know that they happen about the same time we're lighting the bridge, marking 52 years since the Stonewall riots in New York City, and how that really jump-started the LGBTQ rights movement. So in closing, I want to say thank you. I hope to see a bunch of faces on this call on Friday night, the 25th at 9 p.m. We'll be gathering on the bridge, and I think it's just going to be a symbolic walk over the bridge, painted in rainbow. I'm looking forward to it. So I hope to see you all there, and thank you.
Thank you for that update, JM. Does anyone have any questions for JM? Right. I'm assuming Chief Pice, there's no more updates for Chiefs Advisory Committee or ESAL. Do you have anything to say?
ESAL had to leave early.
That's fine. We'll move on to a school update. Dr. Martianhausen, do you have any type of update for us today?
Well, as we welcome Dr. Hamilton and begin our training sessions with our teachers, one of the most important things that we need to do is equip our educators on how to be able to have these conversations with our young people in our classrooms, and how to create that space where every student is valued, welcome, and loved when they come into every classroom. And we have work to do. And we're excited about the team that we're building and the opportunity to partner with the city and to continue what has been started. So I don't know, Dr. Hamilton, do you have anything to add as you just officially started this month?
The only thing I might add is that I ask that you utilize all the resources at your disposal, which includes myself and my network of people from Dublin City Schools as you continue to do the work that you do.
Thank you. Moving on to new business. Is there any new business or discussion from the members of the task force that they would like to bring up?
Before we adjourn, Kofi, I think we have to approve the minutes from last meeting. Although maybe we don't have enough people.
We did that in the beginning.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You're fine. All right, hearing no discussion for new business, I will accept a motion to adjourn.
A motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? All right, thank you for spending your evening with us today. We are adjourned. Have a good week.
evening. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, Dana.